Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second virtual power breakfast. I hope everyone has got some bacon and eggs and some coffee ready, and we're going to go through a great presentation today. So I'd just like to start, of course, by thanking all of our core funding partners. So Fleming College, Trent University, Peterborough Utilities, of course, our Peterborough Angel Network, the City of Peterborough, City of Kawartha Lakes, the Federal Economic Development Agency, and the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Again, if it wasn't for these core funding partners, a lot of our programs that we run, we wouldn't be able to run. And as well, I would like to thank all of our other partners as well. You know, we've got a lot of partners that that help out both financially, but also really support our organization through mentorship and help a lot of our entrepreneurs. So it's very important that we thank them because they give a lot of their time in order to make sure that we continue to generate the next generation of entrepreneurs and continue building businesses in our region. As most of you know, but we have a membership or a team of 5. So myself, John Gillis, who we now will be referring to as Mr. Water Canada going forward. John won the award yesterday for top business person for Water Canada magazine. So congratulations. Maybe just everybody give John a thumbs up. Of course, we've got Rose, who's our marketing manager and innovation specialist. Lana Dahl, which handles all of our operations and events, and Rachel Stark, who is our communications coordinator. So thank you to that team. They're a great team. They work with me every day, and we continue obviously supporting our 60 plus different businesses that we're always supporting. We've got a great set of board of directors that are really a cross section of academia, business, a lot of expertise. This is a volunteer board, so again, I'd just like to thank them for contributing their time to make sure that they steer us on the right course and also provide us a lot of guidance as we continue to support entrepreneurs in our region. For those of you that don't know, our catchment area is fairly large, and so we basically go from the whole center of Peterborough, the county of Peterborough, including the city of Kawartha Lakes, all the way up to Haliburton. And we have 3 physical offices. So one downtown Peterborough, which of course, like all of you are aware, is closed right now due to COVID, but we're hoping with as the province continues to open up regulations that we're gonna have that incubator back open very soon. Trent University, which is a lab for clean tech, and it's a clean tech makerspace. And our most recently opened office, which is in city of Kawartha Lakes as well. And again, same with Peterborough, we're hoping that both of them will be open very soon and a great center for entrepreneurs to be based out of as well as to drop in. So how do we impact Peterborough and Kawarthas? So quickly I'll talk about that, but just a sort of a reminder for everyone, you know, statistically, typically 80% of companies fail in their first 2 years, but there's lots of stats proving that if you're part of an incubation program and that you're working with an organization like the Innovation Cluster, you know, we can reduce that down to 30%. And so I think organizations like ours are obviously very key to really help build the next economy and build the next great companies. And as part of what we do is really 3 big focuses. So our objective and our purpose is to strengthen innovation and the entrepreneurial capacity of our region, to assist new companies in their formation and growth, and really to grow our knowledge-based economy, which is where intellectual property-based businesses are. Typically, your knowledge-based businesses that take longer to grow and typically require a lot more support. But once they're built, they're typically much stronger, more stable organizations, which, you know, hopefully would turn into large employers. In the last year, we supported 53 companies, so 49 were innovation and technology, and 4 of them were youth. So give us a total of 53 companies. That resulted in 212 employment positions. Oh, I missed a slide. And $10 million in economic development for the region. So for those of you that are not a client and want to become a client, of course, the easiest way to do that is to go to www.innovationcluster.ca and just fill out the form there. As a lot of you know, we've got a lot of events coming up, and since we've switched to COVID, we've actually increased the amount of events that are happening. They are all still virtual today, but the next three that we have coming up, so on June 16th, and of course all of these you can register off of the Innovation Cluster's website onto Eventbrite. So June 16th, we've got the importance of crash testing your business on paper. June 17th, we have a hands-on for strengthening diversity, equity, and inclusion with Community Race Relations Community of Peterborough. June 18th, of course, we've got a virtual open house for anybody who hasn't been through our organization. It's an open house really to kind of give you an idea of what's happening behind the scenes. We'll kind of walk you through the different services we have, and you'll be able to get to meet each of us sort of one-on-one as well. And then June 23rd, we've got a hands-on from LLF, which is everything you need to know about incorporation. Now, events like this are never possible unless we've got a great sponsor. So we have Rhonda Keenan, the president of Peterborough and Kawartha Economic Development. Rhonda and her organization really stepped up to help us at the beginning of this year to sponsor these breakfasts. And I'm going to turn it over to Rhonda for a second just to say a few words on behalf of PKD. And we'll unmute Rhonda.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Normally, I know there's a delicious breakfast that I think our sponsorship is usually responsible for, but so hopefully you've made a great one on your own, and we can do these in person very, very soon in the future. And thank you, Mike, for the introduction. Peterborough and the Kawartha's Economic Development, we're the regional economic development agency for the city and the county of Peterborough. And like all economic development agencies throughout the province, it's our job to take care of our companies and employers in the region. It's our job to support entrepreneurs and small business operators to grow and expand their business. It's our job to try to attract new industry to the region, as well as attract visitors to enjoy this place as a tourist destination. But more importantly, we really try to help our businesses plan for the future and ensure that this community is a dynamic region for industry to thrive. So currently with COVID, certainly making those things much more difficult, but we do know that this region is pretty resilient, and businesses do support one another, and as well as the economic development agencies that exist in this region. So when the impacts of COVID were starting to dawn on us and realizing how big this was going to be, Peterborough and the Kawartha's Economic Development, we partnered with our usual partners, the Chamber of Commerce, the Downtown Business Improvement Area, Community Futures, and of course the Innovation Cluster. And we all came together to see how we can best support our businesses during COVID and getting us into a state of transition. And so we were one of the first communities to launch a recovery plan for this region. And we have the backing of the mayor and warden to create a task force where we listen to business. And really the purpose of that task force is to identify what actions we need to take and what activities we should be doing right now to help businesses respond and recover from the impacts of COVID-19. And so I think it's important that we are giving as many tools as possible. And I think having events like the Power Breakfast, where we have these great, amazing guests, giving information to the business community is exactly what we need to be doing right now to be informing businesses, informing the business community of what's in store so that they can properly plan and pivot their business as needed. So happy to be a sponsor, and thank you for the time to talk this morning.
Well, thank you, Rhonda, again, and thank you for all your support. Like I said, we really appreciate it, and we appreciate everything you're doing for our region as well. You've definitely been a catalyst to bring all those organizations together, and of course, the larger group that you brought together. I mean, we've got somewhere between 50 and 60 different organizations, all being represented in different aspects of our community, and you've done a great job of working with our mayor and warden to coordinate that large group of people with different interests to make sure that they're all on the same page, and you've done a good job. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. Next, I'm going to introduce Mr. Leo Bonato, who's the Deputy Division Chief in Western Hemisphere Department of IMF, which is International Monetary Fund, where he's the Mission Chief for Peru, Antigua, and Barbuda. After joining the IMF in 2000, Mr. Bonato has worked on several countries in the Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia. Previously, he also held positions at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand and Banque Commerciale Italiana. He holds a Master's of Art and Economics from Boston University and one from the University de Modena. And he's an extremely accomplished author with many published journals. And if you were to Google his name very quickly, you would see pages and pages of reports that he's written. So we're very excited to have Leo join today, and we're going to turn things over to him. I am going to go through his slides, so you will let me know when to change the slides. So, sir, it's over to you. Thank you again for coming. We really appreciate it.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you. I hope you're all well and safe. And thank you for having me this morning. So these are the topics I would like to cover. To give you some information about the pandemic, how the developments internationally and at home, what has been the policy response of governments in general to the pandemic, both in terms of the specific health care related response, but also the economic policy. Talk a bit about the economic impact that this pandemic has had, and lastly about the role of my organization, the IMF, on addressing the problems that the COVID-19 has brought. So the next slide, just on the pandemic, and then moving to the next one on total cases and new cases. So this is just two charts in which we show the number of cases by country. As you see, Canada is the thick red line. Clearly the US is for number of cases at the top, but the behavior has been fairly common to all these countries. Are all more or less advanced economies. In terms of the daily new cases, confirmed new cases, you can see that even in the US, the curve is starting to flatten, but the rise has been quite spectacular there. Next slide, please. Mortality has been has varied a lot across countries. You can see Canada is kind of middle of the pack there, but France has been quite high. The daily new deaths have been very rapidly increasing in Spain, Italy, and but they're now on a declining path. Canada has come a bit late, but it has also remained much lower than in other countries. The next shows just a heat map in terms of the mortality rates that we can see. The yellow is the lowest, and it increases in intensity up to through a deep blue that you can see as the United States. Again, Canada has been fairly, if you compare it with the United States, the mortality has been much lower, and the incidence also of the disease has been much lower. In terms of infection rates per thousand of people has been definitely lower. So, but we have a situation in which the US has been a hot spot and still remains a hot spot. We are not out of the woods yet. In terms of diffusion, here is a more specific chart. You can see that the number of, this is more clear chart about the mortality in relation to the infection rate. And you can see, as the chart before showed, Spain has been very high, Italy has been quite high, the UK has been high. And again, Canada has been relatively less hit than other countries. Next slide, please. This is This model is like a workhorse for epidemiologists, and has been used widely in this crisis to try and mimic what the behavior of the pandemic, and trying to predict the evolution of the pandemic in different countries. So it's basically a model that divides population in three, actually would be 4 parts: the susceptible, the exposed, the infected, and the recovered. For simplicity, the chart only shows the 3 of these, and the passing from one stage to the other is connected with some probability rate, and there is a coefficient, this R0, which is just you can look at all the different probabilities and you just multiply and divide them. But this coefficient has been used a lot, this R0, because if it's higher than 1, it shows that the pandemic is still developing. And if it's lower than 1, it means that the situation is improving and is moving towards a reduction. The next slide, please. So this is important because it shows that by itself, the pandemic would die out. If you look at these 3 lines, the blue line is the number of susceptible. The infection is the brown line, and the yellow line is the number of recovered. So the pandemic, the number of infected tend to increase exponentially. And with that, you also have a decline in the number of those who are susceptible and an increase in the number of people who recover. But the shape of this curve is extremely important. The shape of the infection curve is extremely important. Next slide, please. Because you have a constraint in all this. The constraint is the capacity of the healthcare system to handle the number of cases. So there have been some countries, including the United States, United Kingdom, that at the beginning of the pandemic, they were thinking maybe the best approach would be to let the pandemic die out by itself. The problem with that approach is that the curve tends to rise above the capacity of the system. And if it does, the system goes under incredible tensions, like it happened in some countries, when people would have to decide, the doctors would have to decide who lives and who dies because they didn't have enough ICU beds or they didn't have enough ventilators. And so it has consequences that are worse in terms of both health and economic reasons. So it is crucial to have containment measures that keep the curve below the capacity of the health system. And this is what many people talked about by flattening the curve. Social distancing was important to flatten the curve. And Canada seems to have been quite successful in that. So the next slide, please. I'm moving now to the policy response to see, and next slide again. First of all, to have a look at what countries have done to contain the pandemic. This is just a snapshot of the largest, the advanced countries. All of them, the red part of the bar is workplace closures. All of them have done that. They have closed schools, all of them. Public information campaigns, yes, with some variation, they all have done that. There have been quite some variation in the way that they have closed public transports. And the cancellation of public events has been quite common. Next slide, please. So this chart shows in a synthetic manner how stringent the policies have been in different countries. And I said, the approaches have varied a lot. Well, the yellow line at the beginning shows China, which was hit before than anybody else. And it shows that China very quickly adopted very stringent measures. And then in about April, when the pandemic was under control, they relaxed them. And then they tightened them again where there was another outbreak. Other countries like Italy have been hit hard, and they also have reacted very strongly. Canada has been hit later, but also policies have been quite stringent, not as stringent as in Italy or in China. And then there have been different approaches, like, for example, New Zealand and Sweden. Sweden was a bit the approach I was mentioning before, sort of less restrictive in terms of policies. The jury is still out whether this has worked well, but the mortality rate in Sweden is quite high. In other countries that has come late in the game has been New Zealand, and it has adopted the most stringent policies. And it has been able to control the disease so that now there are no more cases of the disease in New Zealand very quickly, so that it was able to relax these measures rapidly. Next slide, please. Another option that has been talked about has been testing and tracking. That seems to have worked well in South Korea. And in terms of testing capacity, well, Canada is one of the countries with the highest testing capacity. I saw that a more updated version of these charts just yesterday, and it shows that the US is now has now tested more than Canada. But so Canada has been able, with a combination of containment policy and testing, to keep the diffusion of the disease under reasonable size. Next slide, please. So obviously, in terms of the economic impact, we have all seen part of that. We have all been, there's been domestic lockdowns in most countries. The lockdown has been synchronized across countries as well. There have been reactions of financial markets with capital outflows from countries that were deemed to be more fragile, and that has tightened financial conditions around the world. There have been firm failures, displacement of workers, and of course also increased disequality, because as I maybe explain it later, the crisis doesn't affect people the same way. If your work allows you to work from home, of course you're in a much better position than if you work in an informal sector in India or in Peru, and you have to go to work regardless, because if you don't go to work, you don't have money and food to bring to the table. So this is a very complex economic shock, in which you have a reduction of supply because production is interrupted, stopped in many sectors. You have reduction of consumption because people don't go out. Of course, they still eat, but they don't have the level of consumption that they would normally do, in terms of going to the restaurant, in terms of going to events or entertainment, and so other things. For many that don't have a permanent job, or that have a job that is in that part of the economy that can still continue to work, then you have losses in income. And that, of course, affects consumption and investment. Exports are going to decline because other countries are having the similar problems that your country is having. And for countries that produce commodities like Canada, you have reduction in the prices internationally. and then you have reduction in the production at home. Firms, many firms are in difficult conditions, and obviously they have financing issues. The uncertainty about the future, this certainly is preventing to invest. Bankruptcies also shrink the productive base of the economy, and so they have a permanent effect on. And then, of course, you have workers that are unemployed, and that reduces demand because they don't have incomes, and reduces supply because you are reducing part of the productive base of the economy. Next slide, please. To give you a snapshot about which sectors have been hit the hardest, this is the change in employment in Canada since February 2020 to April. As you can see, hospitality industry has been hit the hardest. And there's quite by a large amount. So many people have lost their jobs. And of course, restaurants have been, either they have been closed or people wouldn't go to restaurants. Other sectors are, again, entertainment, culture, recreation, as I said. Events have been suspended or museums closed. Large events with lots of people have been all cancelled. And then you go down the list and you see services, trade, construction, etc. Government, financial activities, partly mining, these have all, the activity in these industries have had more continuity even under the lockdown. So the loss of employment has been less. Next slide, please. So the reaction of government has been quite strong in most countries. I think broadly we can think about the policy goals, saving lives, and so to take measures on the health sector and to take containment measures in terms of border control and lockdowns. Protecting jobs and people. It's in many countries, transfers have been made to allow people to go through this difficult time, or to address their loss of income, or to prevent from having to go to work regardless. Unemployment insurance, of course, is typical in advanced economy, not so much in other countries. Postpone utilities payments, for example, has been measures that have been taken in many countries. And sometimes even distribution of food for the families who are having more difficulties. For firms, we have seen a lot in a lot of countries, tax deferrals or cuts, programs of lending to firms, particularly small firms, or with credit guarantees from the government, or wage subsidies to avoid that firms laid off workers, and sometimes equity injections. And the fourth goal has been making sure that credit doesn't stop, like it happened in many other crises. So easing of bank regulations, programs, as I said, for loans to SMEs, automatic rollover of debts, and direct intervention of state-owned banks in some countries. Next slide, please. So moving to the next slide again. Moving to economic impact. So the chart to the left shows a comparison between, for China, a comparison between the COVID crisis with the global financial crisis in 2009, 2010. And the global financial crisis is shown, is the red line, and it shows retail sales and industrial production. The blue line is the COVID. So as you can see, there is quite a difference in the way that the economy has reacted to the crisis. In China, it's particularly striking. Look at the US unemployment rate. The global financial crisis, the increase was below 2%. Now it's been like 10%. And lastly, to the right, in Europe and in emerging markets, the PMI index shows a severe contraction between February and March in all these countries. Next slide. As I said, a very large decline in commodity prices. For oil, there was a particular issue also with the OPEC, that the agreement broke down and brought a very rapid decline in the price of oil. It has recovered somewhat since. Next slide. And as I mentioned before, the financial situation has tightened. These are the corporate spreads. So it's the difference between the high yield and the low yields. So between the safest assets and the less safe assets in the corporate sectors in different countries. So you have the US and the Euro. And it shows that they shoot up very rapidly. Sovereign spreads, this is relates to government paper. It has also increased in many emerging economies quite rapidly. Next slide. So in a situation like this, this crisis started, we're talking about for Western economies about 3 months ago. So some of the data, typically you see some economic information, it has some lags. So, and things develop so rapidly that you have to be able to use different information. The typical economic data are not sufficient to follow the developments of a rapidly moving crisis like this. So this chart, for example, shows for Canada figures for exports and imports that are estimated based on the number of cargo ships that move to and from Canada, which is going to give you a good approximation of how you would expect exports going actually through customs in Canada and in the destination countries. And it shows, whereas exports have not, for Canada haven't changed a lot, but there has been a very marked decline in imports, showing that the impact on the contraction of the economy domestically has been quite strong. The next chart. And then travel stopped almost completely in many countries. This shows just the US and Canada. You see the number of flights in the US between March and April. Oh, this is both domestic and international flights, completely collapsed because the government also took some measures. They stopped some flights from certain areas. In Canada, there also been a very rapid decline, and then the situation has stabilized at a lower level. Next slide, please. This is our data from Google. For those of you who use Google Maps, you probably know they ask you to define what's home and what's work. So this shows the movement as recorded by Google Maps in Canada from by different categories, so by workplace and by residential. You can see that the movement to workplace has completely collapsed around March and is slowly recovering now. The movements to residential areas has slightly increased, so people have moved a lot more to just residential areas, but the movement has been much lower than the decline in the movement to work. So this is just effects of the lockdown and of reduced economic activity in general. Next slide, please. This is instead Apple mobility trends. I think this is when you ask for direction to your Apple device. So the number of requests for direction, I think the red line is when you're walking and the blue line is when you are driving. They have both collapsed. They go together quite clearly. It's also good to show that the number, though, has started increasing back in April, and now in June is almost back to the original level. Hotel reservations, I think this is, for Canada. Again, in March, they collapsed. And in April, starting in mid-April, there has been a very slight recovery. Next slide, please. Restaurant reservations, so open table, completely collapsed, and they've been basically totally flat at zero between March and May. I think you know better than me, but it was not, I think restaurants were closed by the government, right? You couldn't go to a restaurant. But in May, I think some restaurants might have reopened as shown by this blip up in the curve. Next slide. And lastly, I think job postings, these are from the Indeed data source. These are job posting in the Canada is the green line and the US is the blue line. Again, very similar behavior. It shows a very rapid fall in April and some increase later. So it's a mixed bag of very bad news, because we have seen a shock of an unprecedented shock, but also some signs that, you know, with the reopening of the economy and barring any you know, possible other outbreaks, things will be slowly getting back to normal. Next slide. This is the number of searches on global online news media coverage. Of the word COVID-19, which shows the concerns of the media for COVID-19 increased a lot up to the mid-March, and then it started declining. Whereas the country reopening has been, this is Canada, country reopening has been appearing in the news more and more in the last couple of months. Next slide. So in terms of numbers for growth projections, what I'm showing you here, these are the IMF projection from the World Economic Outlook that was published in April. This shows that the global growth in the world would be minus 3% in 2020. And it was revised down from October by 6.4%. So it's been a big change due to this unexpected and unprecedented shock. What I can tell you, we are actually updating this projection as of now, and they are going to look much worse because what we have seen has been April has been a very bad month in most economies in the world. In May, there are signs of recovery, but overall, we are seeing double-digit negative growth in many countries. For Canada, again, we were projecting in April minus 6.2. I think it's going to be worse. But of course, as I said, there are aspects that make you think that, when the lockdown is over, again, barring other outbreaks, the economy should be able to restart reasonably quickly. So the projection for Canada is that next year it will record a pretty good growth rate. And so is the same for other countries. Next slide, please. But the uncertainty is extremely wide. I don't think in my lifetime, I've never seen as much uncertainty as of now. And this is clearly the largest recession I've ever experienced. It's even in April, when we were projecting -3 for the world, this was the largest recession since the Great Depression. And as I said, we're going to revise down further. This is just show how we are predicting the recovery next year, starting in the second half of 2020. But again, the uncertainty is so wide that you can still have very different outcomes, and part of the uncertainty is related to the ability of many economies to control and prevent other outbreaks, and partly is related to how much scarring the COVID-19 shock has left in many of the economies. Next slide, please. So these are alternative scenarios that, for example, a longer outbreak in 2020, shown by the blue line, or a new outbreak in 2021 would produce, again, negative growth rates in 2021. Or for emerging markets, a longer outbreak in 2020 plus a new outbreak in 2021 would have really very disastrous consequences. Next slide. I think it's quite important. One question to ask, and for all of us, is what kind of recovery we would like to see. And there have been some lessons that we have learned from this event. And certainly that many of us were surprised by how possible it is to work from home in an efficient and effective way, more than we expected. Certainly, this has been my experience. I've been working from home since February, and our work has increased a lot, but we have been able to do it from home, and it's been quite interesting to have experiences like having an executive board meeting remotely. I still prefer the physical meetings, but if we look at the future, you could see that maybe telework will be more. Many people will think of telework as something that can be done more frequently, and this obviously has consequences in terms of work, and the digital transformation is particularly important, but it's also important at the same time to take into account the consequences that these have in differentiating across sectors. There will be industries that can do it and other industries that cannot. We have also, before the COVID crisis, we were all very concerned about climate change. This is, of course, probably the next big crisis that is facing us. And unfortunately, it's a very difficult problem to tackle, and countries haven't been, despite the Paris Agreement, many countries are not really implementing. They're not implementing policies that are consistent with their commitments to reduce carbon emissions. And so, at the same time, by stopping the economy for a while, we have realized how things can look different, you know, less congestion or clean rivers and I remember the pictures of seeing dolphins in the canals in Venice has been quite striking. So one hope is that we can put together policies and support for having, you know, for moving to a different economy in which that doesn't rely on carbon so much. And of course, one thing that we have learned from the global financial crisis, but also from this crisis, is that unfortunately these shocks hit people in different ways. And having a society in which there are disparities in income and in working conditions that are too wide is not good for anybody. And we should try as much as we can to address these differences and make sure that the growth is more inclusive for everybody. Next slide, please. The role of the IMF, there are just a few facts here. It was established after, well, it was still during the Second World War by some of the countries that won the war. And the idea was to not repeat the mistakes that led to the war in the first place. And so both the IMF and the World Bank were established to avoid policies that would lead to conflicts. So the IMF in particular was put in charge of international monetary and financial stability. The IMF counts now about 189 countries, and there are 147 nationalities represented by staff. The executive board has 24 members that represent all the member countries. The lending capacity that the fund has as of now is about $1 trillion. And currently there are 36 lending arrangements. But in the last 3 months, about 100 countries have asked for financial assistance. And I think 67 have received financial assistance so far. The interest rate on loans to low-income countries is 0 and is below market even for countries that are for higher income. And then about 300 million are spent for capacity development, which is one very important activity of the fund. The fund is like a club in which members have to put down a quota to enter. The quotas are determined by economic size. It's not like an international organization like the UN, where every country counts for one. They are the financial basis for the IMF and determine the subscription, the voting power of the countries, and the access to financing. Next slide, please. So to give you an idea of what the world would look if it's, rather than the territory will weighed by the GDP, this is what it would look like. Of course, countries like the US would occupy a much bigger space. Shrinking poor Canada in the north. Same thing for the EU, and Latin America will look a bit smaller. Next slide. Canada has its own constituency, and it includes many Caribbean countries and Ireland. Constituencies are formed by countries who decide to put together for different reasons. So this represents more or less the weight of Canada in the board of the IMF. Next slide. So I think to summarize what the IMF does is basically 3 things. what we call surveillance is actually a monitoring of all the economies of the member countries. Typically, a mission goes to the country, has a discussion with the authorities on the economic policies, on economic developments. It provides recommendation, it writes a report, and the report is discussed by the board that sends a message to the country. Of course, there is ongoing policy advice and constant contact with typically the central bank and the Ministry of Finance in these countries. And also there is multilateral surveillance. We produce multilateral products like the World Economic Outlook. And what is particularly important now is financial assistance. When there is a crisis and countries have what we call balance of payment problem, that is they don't have the money to pay basically what their debt due during the year, then they ask the IMF. And as I mentioned, capacity development, we provide training, expert advice, regional centers on various issues that are necessary for the functioning of, say, the central bank or the good revenue administration, tax policy, and several issues. Next slide, please. Do we have time to see a video, just a couple of minutes, because that could explain better than I can the lending function. Michael?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Can you click on that video, please? There is a link in the page. The next page, sorry, the next slide.
Yeah, I'll just bring it over on.
Why might a country go into an economic or financial crisis? Perhaps.
Can everybody see the video okay? Just a thumbs up.
A country go into an economic or financial crisis. Perhaps it mismanaged its economic policies. Maybe global demand for its exports, say commodities, went down rapidly, or it faced a natural disaster. As a result, the country is no longer able to pay its bills like debt payments or public sector salaries. What does the country do? The IMF was established more than 70 years ago precisely for this reason, to provide emergency financing and help countries stabilize their economies. Without such financing, the impact on the country and its people would be much worse. Countries often come to the IMF when they have no other lending options. Private investors and banks may be unwilling to risk giving money to a troubled country. The IMF provides short-term loans at an interest rate much lower than the market. It also provides zero-interest loans to poorer countries. Because IMF lending is fast and flexible, it gives countries breathing room by allowing them to meet their immediate financial needs. That breathing space gives time for new policies to have an impact. The IMF works with countries to resolve issues that led to the economic crisis in the first place in a way that puts the economy on a firmer footing, while paying attention to protecting the poor and vulnerable. These groups are typically affected the most by crises. The IMF's involvement sends a strong signal of support among private investors and banks. This helps give investors the confidence to come back and invest. Regaining this source of financing further helps the country get back on its feet. The IMF currently has lending arrangements of about $185 billion with 36 countries, enabling them to strengthen their foundations for inclusive growth that benefits all citizens.
If you're
Michael, let me
confused
know
by
when
the
the video
difference
is
between the
finished, because I
International
can-
Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank, well, you're not the only one. Famous economist John Maynard Keynes, who was a founding father of both institutions.
You should see, it says, what is the IMF doing in COVID now?
The IMF and the World Bank are closely linked.
Okay, thanks. So, yeah, the slide just lists what the video already showed. The important thing is that this financing is important because it allows countries to get some breathing room. And so, for example, if you don't have the money to pay your debt, you don't have to increase taxes in a difficult moment to get that money, or you don't have to reduce spending, which would aggravate the difficult phase the economy is going through. This is basically the reason. Next slide, please. Yes, so as I said, lending, we have about 1 trillion capacity. 1/5 of the capacity has now been committed. There has been about 23.6 billion lent to 67 countries that out of the 100 that have requested. There is also some financing that is precautionary, that is countries get a credit line and they use it if they need it. This has happened for Peru for 11 billion and Chile in 23.8 billion. And then there have been new financing arrangements and augmentation of existing arrangements. There has been debt relief. We have a facility, it's called Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust, that gives debt relief to poorest countries. And 27 countries have been given this debt relief after the crisis started. The IMF contributed to the G20 debt service suspension initiative, which could make 12 billion available to 71 low-income countries so that they don't have to repay their debt during the crisis. Policy advice has been enhanced dialogue with countries, information sharing. We have a policy tracker. The link is here, but now I think we don't have the time to go and look, but it shows what the policy response to COVID of about 193 countries. So you can go and see for yourself. And capacity development, of course, there have been new priorities now for technical assistance, depending on you know, the most urgent problems that need to be addressed. And then there has been online learning that is also free for not only for the authorities, but for the general public on our website. And this next slide concludes. So thank you very much. And I'm open to your questions.
That's great, Leo. Thank you very much. What I'm going to suggest, if anybody has any questions, if you want to just put them in the chat, and then I can read them off to Leo. Elena, we've got the chat turned on, right?
Yep, it's open for everybody.
Thank you. No questions at all so far. Jeremy, I can see you. You sure you don't have a question? Here we go. We got a couple coming in now. Excellent. So first question is, there's been a lot of discussions about shoring or near shoring. Keen for comments on that concept.
Shall we take more questions, or do you want me to?
Yeah, so Leo, the first question is, there's been a lot of discussions on shoring or near shoring, and just wonder if you had a couple comments about that.
I think the comment is, we were talking about global change and the importance of global change in today's economy. And so the COVID-19 has made some people reconsider whether global changes are good for the global economy. In general, you would think from a general economic standpoint, it makes sense to produce a product where you have a comparative advantage. So global changes have shown to be a quite efficient way to do it. Now, the question is whether do you need to have everything produced at home. In general, everybody would agree that you don't. In a crisis like this, even in a crisis like this, you would think that having the possibility of getting different products from different countries at the cheapest price is still a good proposition, right? So I don't see that the COVID-19 has changed this completely. Certainly, it has made you think about whether do you need to go to China to buy your face masks when you need them, and why don't we produce them enough at home in a situation like this? So I think you have to find a combination about, so there is some legitimate onshoring that I can see in a situation like this, but you shouldn't abandon the idea that that it's good for countries and it's good for everybody. That say if Thailand can produce a product at a lower cost than me, keeping some basic standards common for everybody in terms of labor, working conditions, etc., then I see that principle remains valid.
No, that makes a lot of sense. It's a great answer. Thank you. I'm going to summarize a couple questions that are coming in. So obviously, I think you did a great job of highlighting the sectors that were greatly affected, obviously, by COVID. What are the sectors that you feel are going to, come out of COVID and become much stronger and become a much stronger, viable sector?
As I said, I think things can change and can change quite rapidly. I don't think anybody thought that we would adjust to this lockdown, at least for the kinds of jobs that I do and others do. Working from home has been quite easy. Of course, the jobs that have been affected the most, as I said, are hospitality industry, restaurant, hotels, entertainment industry, and all the industry that are contact intensive. But this is a very specific characteristic of how, a pandemic that imposes containment measures, which in themselves create a differentiation in the economy between parts of the economy that can work without contacts, and other parts of the economies that cannot work without contacts. Again, as I said, I don't think we could ever eliminate this difference. And so what the policy response should be is to help those parts of the economy that are hit the most, and to alleviate the need for those workers and firms to operate in unsafe conditions. These are preconditions, for controlling the disease and also to getting the best economic outcome.
Great, thank you. I think that's an excellent answer. And obviously, they're tough questions. Just what's your perspective on Canada's standing in regards to our debt ratios?
I don't work on Canada, so I cannot comment on this. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. I work on Peru and Antigua and Barbuda, so you can ask everything you want about those two countries, but not Canada. I'm sorry.
No problem at all. The next one's a bit long. So as the political scientist Ian Bremmer has suggested, COVID-19 is a big enough shock to many institutions for them to consider adapting or modifying their procedures. Do you see the IMF reforming to meet the needs of its mission post-COVID-19?
Yes, definitely. I think we are trying to think constantly on how we can best adapt to this new situation. As I said, I'm quite proud of how my institution has been able to address this problem. As I said, 100 countries asked for help, and in 3 months of teleworking, we have been able to address their needs for 67 out of 100. I think that's an accomplishment that nobody expected could be. So, first of all, adjusting to the urgent needs. But you're right, I think in terms of the perspective, I think maybe the discussion we had on this recovery is very important. You know, what kind of economy do we want? We have gone through, and we still are going through a terrible crisis. If we have to put the basis for a new economy, which are the things that we want to emphasize? And I said, smart, it has to do with working in different ways and using technology even more, but paying attention to the impact, the different impact that this has on different parts of the economy. This is one thing. Greening is, I think the IMF is going to talk more and more about climate change, because we think, again, this is going to be the next big crisis. So we're going to talk about taxing carbon, which I think is the best way to address the problem, while compensating for those that are hit. But it's very important that, that carbon is priced correctly, and that relative to other technologies, so that we can move more rapidly towards the emission targets that the Paris Agreement has set. And then I think also putting more emphasis on the distributional impacts of any policy advice that we give, because if inequality increases, this is not good for the growth and for the society as a whole. It has disrupted effect that has we have seen them in the politics in many countries. The growth of populism in many countries, including Western Europe, has clearly complicated politics and made it more difficult to get to a more consensual approach to policy in the world. So I think when we look to the future, we have to think about how to construct a society that doesn't lead into that direction.
Thank you, Adam. Actually, this is another question that sort of leads into that. So which countries are right now the greatest concern for the IMF when it comes to debt GDP ratios? Or maybe just concerns overall with everything?
Well, there is a general concern that debt is going to increase a lot. But I don't think the concern is so much for the advanced economies, because if you have very high debt, but interest rates are extremely low, if your debt is going to be sustainable, growth is going to be higher in the next few years. And if there is a moment when you have to accumulate debt, this is one, because there is a huge need for emergency assistance in different parts of the economy. And if you want to avoid permanent damage, you have to act rapidly now. So this is our policy advice. We don't have a concern for advanced economy, obviously not for Canada, obviously not for the US. We have concerns for some emerging economies and certainly low-income countries. They're going to be hit hard. If we look at the hotspot of COVID-19 now is Latin America, and the country where I work on, Peru, now is in a very difficult situation because they don't seem to be able to get the pandemic under control. this implies maybe further containment measures down the road, which means further economic damage down the road. So Peru has a very low debt, so it's not a concern. But other countries, say like Argentina, is now negotiating a debt restructuring. So that's obviously one key concern we have, that they can manage to get a debt restructuring that let the economy restart. But I think in general, emerging market economies are not in a bad shape. Low-income countries have borrowed a lot in the last few years, and there will be a lot of need for richer economies to assist these economies and to give some debt relief, because when your debt burden is too high, your economy cannot grow.
Excellent, thank you. I have another question I'll answer for you, and I should have said at the beginning, Leo's actually from Dalian from Washington. So not from Canada, but from Washington. So we really appreciate that. I think just the one last question, because I know we've got a bit of time from Santa Duick actually, is COVID-19 has led to a rise in discussions around the modern monetary theory. What's your thoughts on that theory?
Well, modern monetary theory is basically said that increasing debt doesn't matter. I almost said the same right now, but it has to be qualified. You have to look country by country whether it matters or not. If your debt becomes unsustainable and countries don't and financial markets don't lend to you anymore, then you are in trouble. Then you have to go to the IMF. So I think modern monetary theory has some interesting insights, but I don't think that its application to the real world is really universal. It certainly works for the US or Canada in general. You would say you can increase your debt by as much as you want right now, because interest rates are near zero. You're going to be able to repay that debt. In general, it's an interesting question. There are different proponents of this theory. I don't have a very good knowledge of the theory myself, so maybe I'm not the best person to. But just what I noticed is that some of the prescriptions do not fully apply to the real world.
I'm going to sort of summarize two questions, if you don't mind, into sort of one, and it has to do with public health policies and economic policies. So they're both sometimes at odds. And first, how do businesses and consumers know how to deal with that? And the second part is how important, or what's the impact you're going to see on mental health because of the situation over the last 3 months, and how will that change how businesses work with people?
Well, this last question, I don't think I'm really qualified to answer. It's clearly this is a situation that produces a lot of stress. I consider myself privileged that I have a job and I have maintained my job during this crisis. But if I think about people who who lost their jobs or who have to go out and work regardless of the danger of doing it, then of course I can see that kind of stress can produce mental health problems very, very rapidly. So I just feel for this, but I'm not qualified to say anything about it. In terms of the trade-offs between public health policy and economic policy, there might be some marginally some trade-offs, but I think in general, what is good for public policy is also good for the economy, in a sense. As I showed that that chart on that epidemiologist model, it shows that if you don't contain the pandemic, you're going to have disastrous results. And these results are going to affect the economy as well as health. So at the margin, there might be, a point in which you say, maybe we open the economy a week earlier, but this is going to cost some lives because some people are going to be infected and die because of that. It's possible. These calculations are terrible. I don't want to be in a position to have to make those. But I don't think that is really a general trade-off. I think public health policy and economic policy should go together at this point. Getting the contagion under control, whether you do it with lockdown or with more testing and tracking, which seems to have a lower economic impact, it doesn't matter. I think they have to go together.
That's great, Leo. I just want to say thank you very much from everybody here in Peterborough and virtually across Canada. I just want to say thank you very much for taking the time today and coming in and speaking to us. We really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It was really nice to be with you and nice to meet you.